Hi, I'm Shan Wu with a Undercolor of Law take on the firing of top JAG Corps lawyers by Pete Hegseth, the new defense secretary. Put up the headline for you here. This story is not getting as much press as the firing of some other top military leaders, but it is just as important. What is the JAG Corps, Judge Advocate General Corps? Well, it has a really long history, actually. It was established by General George Washington in 1775. And one of the things it had done way back when was it developed the code of conduct for soldiers to use, even in the Civil War. And they eventually became involved with how does the U.S. military regulate itself to comply with the Geneva Convention codes of conduct. Their everyday work, they prosecute and defend under the Military Code of Justice, what we know as court-martials, and it's popularized by TV shows like JAG. And they're lawyers and military officers, and they actually make up one of the nation's largest law firms, if you think of them that way, with over 4,000 plus lawyers. Besides the prosecution and defense function in court-martials, they also provide crucial advice to military leaders about the code of conduct, how campaigns can be lawfully carried out. Now, we'll put up a sample of the analysis of what they do here, and I'll quote from this resource, which says that one of the most solemn duties the JAG Corps is responsible for is ensuring the U.S. Army compliance with international law, the laws of war, and prosecuting war crimes. Perhaps the most famous example is the prosecution of war crimes in World War II. The resource summarizes the Geneva Convention's 4 treaties that form the core of international humanitarian law. It's talking about the rights and protections for non-combatants in war. There's the protection of the sick and wounded soldiers on the battlefield, protection of sick and wounded shipwrecked service members, the treatment of prisoners of war, important point, and the protection of civilians during war. Now, more recently, this seems like a long time ago now, but I think it's important to remember it was the JAG Corps, or lawyers from JAG Corps, who first stood up and sounded the alarm on the torture of detainees post 9/11, the so-called enhanced interrogation methods that were used on these detainees, some of them Guantanamo, some of them in other sites out of the country. It's a whole separate legal controversy over what they called the extraordinary rendition, which was to remove the detainees from U.S. soil, interrogate them in other countries, other laws applying as part of a question of what would U.S. law govern in terms of what they could be treated as. But whatever the U.S. law was, the U.S. military law had to be used in a way that brought it in line with the Geneva Conventions. And it was the JAG Corps that raised this question that they were concerned with how these detainees were being treated. We remember the stories of the waterboarding, forced positions, threats, beatings, etc. And at the time, or shortly after that period, as all this began to come into the open, a lot of the memos, opinions by the JAG Corps had been classified. No less a staunch conservative than Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina once told a top JAG Corps leader, quote, "If they had listened to you from the outset, we wouldn't have had a lot of the problems we've dealt with," meaning all the scandals, all the concerns over how we were behaving with treating these people. Now, Hegseth seems to be selling the value of this law advice kind of short, and we might remember the often misunderstood Shakespeare quote from Henry VI, Part 2. The famous line is, of course, "First thing we do is let's kill all the lawyers." Now, this is a quote that I really like to talk about a lot in different contexts because this is not a general complaint about lawyers the way it's used in popular culture. Rather, it's Shakespeare pointing out that the way to tyranny is to get rid of the law. And the spokesperson in that scene is the right-hand man of a very vicious authoritarian who wants to have a coup. And that's really what Hegseth is doing by ridding the JAG leadership, because he wants to, according to him, install people with a, quote, warrior ethos. Or maybe we can translate that into people who will not raise an alarm over illegal, inhumane practices. And perhaps there's a clue here from Hegseth's own past that may illuminate his attitude on this. During his confirmation hearings, he refused to say that he supported the Geneva Convention's ban on torture. As a Fox host, he championed pardons for U.S. soldiers convicted of murdering civilians, war crimes. And one of those was a soldier turned in by that soldier's own troops for ordering them to fire on unarmed Afghans from 100 yards away, killing those people, and then covering up the evidence with fake reports, including fake radio reports. That particular soldier was sentenced to 19 years in prison for second-degree murder, among other charges. Trump pardoned him. And as reported about the pardon, some of the people who were most upset by the pardon were his fellow soldiers, some of them under the command, who had heroically reported these murders, coming forth against kind of the wall of silence, having to stand up in that very uncomfortable, courageous position. Their courage to do the right thing was discarded by that pardon. Now, it's also perhaps no surprise that Hegseth has this view because the combat team he had been stationed with had experienced court-martials and murder convictions for, among other things, the soldiers admitting that they had set detainees loose and then shot them in the back, murdered them as they ran away. Important to note here, Hegseth was not personally involved in these allegations, but it was the unit that he had served with. And it seems to have given him a view where he's very skeptical of the application of law to what the military does. His view seems kind of consistent with this stereotypical fake cowboy macho myth in his mind of the brave white warriors fighting off the barbaric brown people, and that the idea is that these American soldiers, absent any non-Aryans and women, should be able to take the law into their own hands because of their entitlement and the dehumanization of the enemy. And that's what really allows murder of unarmed detainees, right? It's the dehumanization unchecked by any rules, unchecked by any laws. And that's what Hegseth objects to, is the idea that, when you're in combat, when you're in these split-second decisions, you can't be hampered by anything like legal niceties. I think he might do well to study recent history where in a congressional hearing, a JAG Corps general testified that the tactics under the investigation at the time about the extraordinary renditions, about the type of interrogation techniques being used that were so brutal, it was his opinion. This was after the fact, after things had been taken out of the classified secrecy realm, that these tactics had violated the Geneva Conventions. He said absolutely yes when he was asked. And then he's also asked by Senator Carl Levin of Michigan if, as a general, he would want U.S. prisoners of war to have been treated that way. He answered, no, we would not. That's maybe something that Hegseth ought to keep in mind, because this idea that his soldiers, he only wants a certain type of soldier, can do anything they want, it's a broader question than that. It's not just what American soldiers can do, it's how we want all people to behave. So we'll keep an eye on this amidst all the other firings that are going on. And do keep the replies and comments coming. Let me know, what kinds of topics you'd like me to cover. Do follow me on Blue Sky. That's another good way to get a hold of me. And we'll talk to you soon.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.